Good morning. How's everyone doing? Are we out there? We're live. We're awesome. Welcome to the 16th Annual Celebrating Words Festival, written, performed, and sung. This festival is hosted by Teachucha Centro Cultural and honors the teaching that our words are medicine found in our stories, creative arts, and culture offerings. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's nice and gloomy out here in LA area. My name is Eric Iñiguez, and I'll be your host for this Razabilly book talk with Professor Nicolas Centino. Nicolas Centino, friend, family almost. He was born and raised on the Central Coast. He earned his doctorate in Chicano Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Inspired by the alternative use cultures he encountered growing up in the rural farm working community of Lompoc, not Lompoc, Dr. Centino's work examines the popular culture practices of Chicanas, Chicanos, and Latinos, Latinas as strategies of survival and negotiation, with a keen eye to ways in which hierarchies of power shape the everyday and mundane experiences of common people. His work highlight often ignored and dismissed narratives of struggles in the contemporary moment, as well as in the eras gone by. Dr. Centino has taught courses at Loyola Marymount University, UC Irvine School of Law, Cal State Long Beach, and UC Santa Barbara. Currently, he's an assistant professor at Cal State Sushi, aka Channel Islands. Good morning, Nico.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, brother. It's an honor. I'm really happy for your book. I'm really happy for this.
Thank you.
It's been a long struggle. Yeah. So start off, man. How did you get to this this book? You know, this whole thing, man.
So when I decided to pursue a doctorate, my initial focus was on sort of cross-cultural, intra-racial organizing, labor organizing. So I was looking at, different movements for labor rights in the Central Coast, specifically in sort of like Ventura, Santa Barbara County. And that kind of was, my focus for a long time was on activism and organizing. And as I started thinking more about other forums or other ways in which resistance happens and takes place, I started getting more fascinated with aspects that we don't typically think about as activism, so to speak, right? Or things that we typically don't think of having a political edge. And that was music, that was dance, that was sort of, thinking about living your life to the fullest as a political act. And so that really started fascinating me. And for myself, in the book, I go into sort of how I stumble onto the LA Rockabilly scene. Mm-hmm. And that was something that I had really kind of immersed myself in. And so when I was looking at and thinking about projects to develop a dissertation on, I thought this is brilliant, right? This, I'm getting this degree, this PhD in Chicano studies. Everybody in these spaces, these leisure spaces, they're all, Central American, Mexican American, so on and so forth. So I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. I'm going to write about what I do on the weekends, right? Worst idea ever. For all you aspiring scholars, I don't recommend it, because as soon as you turn on that, that little microscope in your head to start analyzing the thing that you love, how you feel about the things that you love change a little bit. So, my spaces of leisure started becoming my spaces of labor as I actually started having to work in terms of observing, in terms of being able to take inventory of the things that were happening around me. And so really, as the project sort of started becoming less and less about me, mm-hmm. and more about LA, and LA in that moment of time, this book started really getting on its feet and really becoming its own thing that, obviously was a story told through my lens and my perspective, but also was an avenue, mm-hmm. right, to really provide these narratives to sort of, I don't want to say speak for themselves, but to really sort of develop their life, its life of its own.
And so the book it goes from, the 50s all the way to even currently, right? But the main focus you would say what the late 90s, mid 90s to 2010s, around that time?
Yeah. We make gestures to the 50s. And I was trying to be real clear with, this particular book. I'm not a musicologist. I wish I had, that skill set. But it's not a strict history per se. Mm-hmm. And there's still a lot of rich information and a treasure trove of stories from the 1950s from the perspective of Raza, right? That still needs to be told. I reference that era. It's a very important era, and you can't tell the story that we tell in the book without looking back to that time period. Yeah. But as you're saying, really, this book, right, is sort of anchored in what I call, kind of a post-NAFTA LA. And so looking at, from sort of the mid 90s all the way up to the aftermath of the subprime mortgage crisis, right? So the Great Recession. Mm-hmm. And it's through these chunk of years that I really kind of, delve into and dwell on LA Rockabilly during those years. As the book sort of wraps up, we do sort of there's sort of a COVID epilogue to the book. So there are things that, I was still working with and thinking about all the way up until we wanted to publish. Yeah. But for the most part, the focus really is on sort of this 96 to 2011 time period. And also, those were the years in which I was, at least the latter half of the years in which I was conducting the research, that I was, in the spaces and observing and participating.
Yeah. And I like the part I like the fact that the whole book is still, there's parallels with the political, environment, right? So like you said, it's a post-NAFTA, but you do discuss like the era of George W. Bush and then continue with Obama years, but also like the recession, right? And how the recession, which was also mainly about the housing crisis was also a space crisis, right? And this you discuss a space as almost a part of, as almost a character, right, in your book, along with other things that we're going to get into. Was there a certain part that you wanted to start to read off on, or did you want to start off like, is there?
Yeah. I wanted to do a little bit of a reading from the text, from the actual book, before we kind of really, do a deep dive into some of the stuff. So I'm going to start at the beginning. I'm going to start, right at the top of the book with the opening lines of the introduction. So yeah, I can do that right now.
Take it away.
All right.
This is going to be very loose also too. Like me and Nico are really friends, really close friends, known for a long time. So we also, the folks who are viewing us, we're going to have a good time, a good chat. Hopefully we'll have some people chiming in as well. So don't think that's going to be a straightforward academic dialogue. It's not going to be also just fun and games either, but we're going to have seriousness with this as well, because this is a very important topic for not just us, but the community at large. So go for Nico.
All righty. On stage, Omar and the String Poppers are a sight to behold. It's 2007 in a Las Vegas casino far from the tourist attractions found on the main strip. In a hall usually reserved for corporate luncheons and wedding receptions, dim stage lights direct the attention of a raucous and bustling crowd to the figures on stage. The band members, hailing from Los Angeles, California, are clad in their sharpest 1950s stage attire, as is most of the audience. Armed with a 2-pound digital camera, I worked my way towards the stage, navigating a sea of tattooed bodies adorned in lurex, rayon gabardine, and raw selvage-lined denim. I try to get as close as I can to photograph the action, but the band's followers in the front row aren't budging. Some have traveled as far away as Japan, the United Kingdom, Lithuania, and they are entranced by the spectacle of sights and sounds on stage. Omar and the String Poppers play Rockabilly, an obscure 1950s subgenre of rock and roll music, briefly made famous by Elvis Presley and a handful of other artists. Like Elvis, the eponymous Omar Romero has a magnetic stage presence as the band's frontman and rhythm guitarist. With a thick frame and broad shoulders, exaggerated by the cut of his black and white 1950s ensemble, Romero's onstage swagger and snarling vocal delivery rival that of the king of rock and roll himself. Framed against a massive banner stating in bold letters, "Viva Las Vegas, Rockabilly Weekend." The band is made up of men far too young to have heard rockabilly music in its heyday. Nevertheless, the band's expert delivery of the signature elements of rockabilly is unmistakable. Stuttering vocals tinged with pain and desperation, deep thuds and clockwork slaps of an upright bass, machine gun electric guitar solos, and a drummer's backbeat as heavy as concrete. It was that expertise that earned them a spot on stage at one of the largest festivals for rockabilly music. Omar and the String Poppers don't so much offer music to listen to as provide an immersive experience. In turn, the audience isn't there just to hear rockabilly music. They're there to witness Omar and the String Poppers become embodiments of rockabilly music through their attire, attitude, and stage presence. From the stark bicolor scheme of the festival's vinyl backdrop, to the upright bass painted bone white with black trim, to Romero's own two-tone belted Hollywood jacket, this is music from a black and white era. Identified as a common root for many of the manifestations of rock music to follow, the musical genre of rockabilly is nigh inseparable from the white male musicians who pioneered the genre's signature 1950s sound. Artists such as Carl Perkins, Johnny Burnett, and Glenn Glenn. For many fans, an embrace of rockabilly music is an embrace not just of the music they enjoy, but also of the cultural values they associate with the mid-20th century, a time before women's liberation and the civil rights movement. Yet despite the historical trappings, this performance is no 1950s reenactment. The band's original material and carefully chosen cover songs strip and bare their emotional cores to the audience. This process is symbolically echoed in the progressive dishevelment of Romero's shining black hair throughout the duration of their set, from an immaculate pompadour to tousled mess as he and his bands work the crowd into an utter frenzy. Although Romero is the focus, the band operates as a single unit, like a musical freight train building momentum across a blistering desert landscape. As Romero scratches out a rhythm on his acoustic guitar to signal the band's next song, I faintly overhear a discreet conversation just out of view. Commenting on the authenticity of the band's sound, a British accented voice declares, I'm not going to do the accent. God, it's like Memphis, Tennessee in 1954. Although it's perhaps intended as an innocent compliment, the remark quickly pulls me out of the moment. What would the American South of the 1950s, long since represented as a social world marked by stark Jim Crow divisions of black and white, make of Omar and the String Poppers? Especially considering that as many rockabilly music fans who have heard the band only on CD are surprised to discover Omar Romero and his bandmates, Angel Hernandez, Victor Mendez, and Santiago Bermudez, are Mexican-American. In fact, U.S. Latinas and Latinos, predominantly of Mexican and Central American descent, have become the primary producers and consumers of rockabilly music in Los Angeles, California, the band's home base. Los Angeles had earned the reputation among many in the international fandom of rockabilly music of being one of the most vibrant and dynamic scenes for the genre in the world. For all intents and purposes, the global capital of that white Southern 1950s music, known as rockabilly, resided in the Latino metropolis of modern day LA. So why rockabilly? This project started with a simple question. Why were Chicanas, Chicanos, Latinas, and Latinos of the 2000s attracted to rockabilly music of the 1950s? Since the turn of the century, working class Chicanas, Chicanos, Latinas, and Latino fans of rockabilly music from LA have become the driving force behind the consumption and production of a social scene dedicated to rockabilly's survival nearly 60 years past its prime. With its distinctive lo-fi sounds of clacking wooden bass slaps, whiskey-tinged hiccuping vocals, and aggressive guitar riffs, rockabilly is a sharp departure from the electronic dance music marketed to contemporary urban audiences. Nevertheless, on any given Friday or Saturday night, in Greater LA, a Latina or Latino promoter can be found hosting a show where a near exclusively Latina or Latino crowd gathers to hear 1950s rock and roll or rhythm and blues music played live by a Latina or Latino musician or selected by a Latina or Latino DJ. The stark incongruity of this pairing of raza and rockabilly, separated by decades of history and miles of geography, simply demanded an answer to the question, why?
Dun dun. Look at that. That was cool, man. It really breaks down a lot of brings up a lot of questions and all that, right? And
yes,
I can see where you had a lot to work with there, and you had a lot of the questions yourself,
yeah,
and how to break it down.
For me, I found out that why was the wrong question. That for me, I found out that the why question was the question that I got a lot, the question that I had myself, but that wasn't the right question to ask. In part because it's almost insulting, right? Mm-hmm. Why do you like this or why do you like that? Well, that presumes that there's a monolithic Chicana, Chicano, Mexican, Central American culture that you have to hold to, and anything outside of those bounds, you're in the wrong, right? So asking why led me towards that frame of mind, and that for me, I discovered through this project that wasn't. That wasn't the kind of frame of mind that I wanted to bring to.
You think that's like a one of the things that most like scenes and subcultures go through, right? And even the term subculture, right, is contentious. We've had talks about like how that is almost, that doesn't identify or label certain scenes, right? Because if by insinuating saying that it's different underneath another main culture, when that main culture is actually itself not monolithic, right?
Yeah, and that's the tricky thing, with subculture. And this is a point that Elisa Gaspar de Alba made, was that if we only look at this stuff as subculture, right, it only is going to regulate it to the diminutive, right? Mm-hmm. What happens when we extrapolate out of that, right? We talk about Chicana or Chicano culture as a subculture. Well, that means that the culture is this dominant Anglo-American thing, which does a disservice to those who have have created culture and have done so for generations long before, right, 1848, long before 1491, so on and so forth, right? So when I was thinking about ways to talk about this intentional community, right, these folks that come together for these shows to celebrate this music, right, or celebrate the fashion, or celebrate the cars, or celebrate whatever else, right, these folks that choose to come together, they all talked about it as a scene, right? And that's the way that, in a lot of music scenes, they talk about it as a scene, right? They don't really use subculture. I mean, that'll pop up here and there, but by and large, the nomenclature of the time, of our time and times before, has been scene. So I said, let me dig into scene. Like, let me try and dig up some stuff in scene. And so when I was reaching back through, the history of studies on subcultures, right? For those that have read on this, Dick Hebdige and, style. And I stumbled on the work of John Irwin. And Irwin was an ex-con and, sociologist, was in criminology, et cetera. And he was trying to, make sense of like these hippies and these surfers that he was like associating with and then inevitably, studying. And for him, the idea of a scene was a lot more in line with both sort of how people just every day, vernacularly talk about the scene, but also in alignment with what I was encountering with Rockabilly in LA, is so much that the scene being this thing, right, really just made up of activities, right? Activity systems, right? So we wanted to get into like systems and stuff, right? So that, groups of folks decide what the systems are, going to shows. That's a big part of the scene. So if you go to shows, you're in the scene, right? Looking the part, right? Some people might do it, some people might not, right? But that becomes an activity system there that can be used to define the scene, right? And people can fight about it, right? Well, if you show up, you're wearing, H&M and Abercrombie and Fitch, maybe you're not a part of the scene, right? Well, if, the one of the lead performers who's a brilliant guitarist or brilliant bass player, they don't want to wear vintage and they want to play rockabilly, right? And they're that good, right? Well, they're participating in other aspects of these activity systems that makes them a part of the scene, right? Mm-hmm. And so for me, this idea of these activity systems being what define the scene, but also what people fight over, gave me a really, really crucial key to understanding how the scene in LA went from predominantly Anglo-American to almost exclusively in these years, brown, raza. Chicano, Latino, however you want to, term that, folk kids and young adults that were of Mexican American and Central American background for the most part in LA.
Yeah, I mean, like growing up, that scene was always like, I mean, if you went to the OC, you saw more white people, right? Yeah, like it's to this day, it's still kind of a thing, and that's part of like the car culture. But anytime you go to like to shows or events, there's always like a clash of different scenes, right? And I think that's part of, I guess clash isn't the right word, but like there's just like amalgamation, like, they're all kind of together.
And that's the thing about Rockabilly. Yeah. And that's the thing about Rockabilly too, in that you have, again, going back to the scene theory, you have to have, right, a landscape of scenes. You have to have ska, you have to have, psychobilly, you have to have punk, you have to have cowpunk, you have to have, the list goes on. In part for these scenes to exist, they have to be in concert, not in concert, but in conversation and in comparison to other scenes. And so as a socially constructed thing, people float in and out of scenes all the time, and with Rockabilly for a long time, the joke was, there's two jokes, right? In LA and in Orange County, Southern California, the joke is that the Rockabilly scene is sort of the punk retirement plan, right? And so you're tired of getting in the pit, like you graduate to Rockabilly, right? In other parts of the country, it's the neo-Nazi retirement plan. So there, again, get into the conversations around race and region and space, right? That's something that we talk about in the book as well. But with Rockabilly, because it is such a, and about not, you know, not to saying the music, right? The music, the genre of music, rockabilly is so much a building block of what you'll see later, right? Of what you'll see, obviously, in punk, right? What you'll see in ska in some ways, right? With what you'll see in these other sort of, going back to subculture, right? Other scenes that folks who are more into these sort of, you know, I don't want to call it counter hegemonic, right? But folks who are more into these quote unquote underground music scenes, there's something for them in rockabilly, right? And for me, in sort of sussing out meaning from you know, what does this mean? What does this scene mean in this moment? That the presence of brown folks in these spaces made that another normalizing factor. So if you had, like, you know, a kid that was a ska kid, but they were, you know, Central American or Mexican American, right? And they didn't see themselves as being different as getting into the rockabilly scene. So that was another, for some of them, a commonality that sort of eased that transition a little bit.
Yeah, you know, it's when I would go to a couple of ska shows, there's this one dude, the first time I ever heard of a psychobilly, right? Because I was like, oh, you like rockabilly? He's like, I don't like that shit. And I was like, all right, come with it. He's like, he likes psychobilly. At that moment, I was young. I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And like, you do a deep dive, which goes back to, like, it's not a monolithic thing, right? Mm-mm. And also, like, just because one person listens to another genre doesn't mean that person's gonna listen to it, right? So right. You do have, like, I mean, everyone, like, for the most part, a lot of people got into it listening to 80s music. I mean, the Smiths and Morrissey, right? And for everyone out there, if you just want to get the book just for that, that'll be on page 85 for all your Moss heads.
That was another thing, you know. There were three questions. One was, what is this, right? So whenever I would leave, sort of, you know, or present or talk about the work outside of LA, you know, or what I call Greater LA. So this might be controversial in the book. I make this claim that Greater LA, right? When people refer to LA, it stretches from all the way down to Anaheim and south, sometimes out to Riverside, San Bernardino, sometimes up to Ventura. So LA, you know, it's like Blade Runner. Like, it is this sprawling metropolis, right? That sort of, you know, transcends, you know, cities. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And again, like, you know, the college thing, right? Like, you know, a lot of folks who are from Downey or from Whittier, when they go to college up in, you know, Berkeley or wherever else, you know, Cal State San Francisco, and people ask them, where are you from? A lot of times they'll start with, well, I'm from LA. And then the follow-up question is, where in LA? And then you get the specific city, right? Yeah. So again, you know, just for me, riffing off of people's popular understanding or popular usage of words, right? For me, when I talk about Greater LA, it's a huge swath of geography, you know what I mean? But getting into that, right? Like, thinking about, you know, how, you know, psychobilly, Western swing, mm-hmm. you know, Central Avenue style, Black R&B, how when we use the term, so I'm also very careful in the book, and I use big R rockabilly and little R rockabilly. When I talk about the genre of music, I use little R rockabilly. And I really try to make this a point, because the rockabilly scene, big R rockabilly, the rockabilly scene, if you go to a rockabilly show, rockabilly, traditional rockabilly, slap bass, echo vocals, you know, that style is just a fraction of what kind of music you'll actually hear. You'll get a lot of sort of late 50s style rock and roll. You'll get a lot of, like, you know, sort of almost like, well, not almost like, you'll get garage rock like the Sonics. Mm-hmm. You'll get stuff like the Ventures, right? But you also get, like, straight up rhythm and blues, late 40s, Louis Prima, Louis Jordan style R&B. And so the what I sort of think about is, like, well, what the music you're going to encounter, the focal point is sort of that, you know, Elvis 56, right? But you get, like, 10 years back, and then you get, like, 10 years forward. And so, and where those boundaries are, they're fuzzy. So depending on, you know, who's sort of in charge that night, who, you know, what mood musicians are, what mood DJs are, they'll push it one way or the other. And so maybe sometimes you'll push it more towards stuff like Los Tintaps, right? or sometimes maybe you'll push it much more towards sort of like a Bob Wills, that more like hillbilly fiddle sound,
Yeah.
and then that gives something for people to fight over, and then you get into tastes, right?
Yeah.
And that's a really a big part of this book is how did these community of folks, right? These, young Raza coming in fundamentally shift the tastes of music and style and other aspects that make up LA Rockabilly to be what they were about, to be what they loved, but did so in a way that still sort of followed the rules of what a Rockabilly show was. Rules that in some ways were sort of codified in the UK. And in this way, they sort of, these brown kids out Rockabilly. And doing so sort of became the torchbearers of Rockabilly from the 90s into the 2000s, sort of the new millennial torchbearers of that genre.
And you talk about the British scene, right? The British Rockabilly scene, and how they had their weekenders, right? And those were the places and spaces that they would come and meet, right? And there was I guess you would say a parallel, or people extracted from that and created their own spaces in the U.S., in the South, and then in L.A. What did you see? Like, did people know that scene at all? Like that you knew, like, because you talked about how there's folks that did not know what Rockabilly is, but still love, like, they weren't around for that. So they don't know the quote unquote authentic thing, right? So did they know about the European thing either, like the British thing?
There's roundabout ways. And again, sort of the why question. Like the why question is really like, what is the magic bullet? Give me the magic bullet here. Like what is the one thing that makes these kids want to get into the scene, right? And there's no one answer to that. You know what I mean? It's such a there's so many diverse paths for folks to discover this, right? So, we can't, for one thing, like we can't at all, bat too many eyelashes at Setzer and Slim Jim Phantom and, the Stray Cats.
The Stray Cats.
The Stray Cats in the 80s, that was a big deal, right? Yeah. MTV and, obviously not every kid in the hood, had access to MTV, but just the exposure the Stray Cats had in the 80s, right? That put germinated the seed for a lot of kids in the 80s who would be musicians or promoters in the 90s or 2000s, because and also because again, back to the authenticity thing, because Stray Cats were so mainstream, a lot of them, a lot of folks wouldn't claim sort of, well, I got into it because of the Stray Cats later on in the 90s and 2000s when like, oh no, I like Glenn or I like Joe Clay, right? The Stray Cats were the MTV band, and so some folks wouldn't cop to that, but that the Stray Cats were mainstream for those moments did go a long way, right?
And so, like, was there like a distinction, or not a distinction? Like, did you see people, like, when you asked them like how they got into it, you kind of saw parallels, like, okay, like they got into the Necromantics and Tiger Army, so they got into that way, and these dudes got in this way, and
in this work I talk a lot about what narratives people had to share with me, right? And so whether, and I didn't judge anybody. I for the most part, I because I think people of color, have been examinated and put under a petri dish for so many generations, like, and sort of second guessed and analyzed in a very anthropological way. Like if someone told me something, for the most part, I did my best to take them at face value. And so when people share with me how they got into the scene, I talk about them as narratives, right? I don't necessarily talk about as the actual factual reason how they got in the scene, right? So and when I looked at the narratives I was getting, a lot of times their first foray or their first sort of introduction to their story about how they got into Rockabilly didn't have anything to do with music. Mm-hmm. It was about connection to history, family, and memory and community. And then sometimes music sort of like started getting in, right? So I got so many stories. Well, I first fell in love in the 50s when I was, looking through a family photo album, and I saw my aunt, and she looked gorgeous, and she had, her hair and makeup, and, my crazy uncle, Rosendo, he had a 54 Chevy that, was just rusting in his backyard. But, and he would just sometimes sit out there and crack a beer. And that was my, all I saw that was a 50s thing. And he was connected to that. And so that was how I got into it. Right. So a lot of times, when I would interview folks or just chit chat and pop the question, right? How did you get into this? Right. More often than not, they would first start with some kind of connection to the era. For me, that means memory. Mm-hmm. Right. And the tricky thing for people who do memory studies is all about what you remember. These are memories of lives that these kids had never experienced. Okay. Right. These were all, latchkey kids from the 80s and 90s. Right. They were in the 50s. Like, now doesn't mean, of course, right. You want to monolithically categorize. There was folks from all different generations. We had folks from the Stray Cats era. We had folks from before. We had kids that were, just getting into it in the 2000s. And so it is a broad span of folks that go to the shows. But by and large, right, the people that made the critical mass of Raza getting into rockabilly at that era, when I asked them questions, like, they came up first with a story about some kind of connection they had to a family member or a loved one or community history that was rooted in that sort of atomic era. Mm-hmm. And for me, that was a big deal because the music was a part of it for sure, right? If they were into cars, like the custom culture was a part of it. If they were into the fashion, that was a part of it too. But it was never strayed too far away from them getting something out of the scene that was more than just entertainment, Okay.
And then, so what are some important places and spaces that, not that that you went to, but also historically helped, like found this whole movement?
Yeah.
Like the Holy Gully, like I went to the Holy Gully, but I only went for 80s and punk shows all the way in Downey. And it was far away, so I didn't go that many times because it was just a drive. It was too far.
Yeah, no. It's funny because there's one part of the, for the most part, this book really it focuses a lot on two venues that were going to be my only venues. I was going to just, go to these two venues and stick with it the whole time. And, then the financial crisis happened. And that shut down a lot of venues. And so actually, the financial crisis is actually almost like its own person in the book. The financial crisis plays a huge role in this book and how, how folks in the scene and more broadly, how Latinas and Latinos in LA survived the financial crisis is a huge part of this book. Mm-hmm. But there was one venue that was in Rosemead, Spikes. It's now a parking lot. Spikes was one of the venues that I wanted to just look at, and there was a patron there, right? And I was asking him like, "Hey man, like what are your favorite venues?" And he kind of gave him like, "What are your least favorite venues?" And we were at Spikes, and he tells me at Spikes, one of his least favorite venues was Spikes. And just kind of continue the conversation. Okay, but you're here. And it's like, yeah, I'm here. I'm like, well, where do you live? Compton. It's like you drove or you got transportation from, Compton, South LA, right, to the San Gabriel Valley to go to one of your least favorite venues, right? So again, sort of, what the scene meant to folks and what people got out of it, right? Whether, whether they're at their favorite venue mm-hmm. or making the effort to go to one of their least favorite venues, right? Yeah. It kind of speaks to the importance of space to the scene, right? And the spaces that were created. For me, kind of mapping the spaces and mapping not all the spaces, because that was, again, sort of beyond my ability to like have, an inventory of every spot that hosted rockabilly music from 1975 to, 2016, 2017. That for me, that was way too much of a challenge to do. And so if there's someone out there that wants to do that, kudos to you. I've got notes. I'll share them with you. But you talked that was beyond, yeah. A lot for sure, like just to do a quick rundown, and some of the ones that I highlight in the book. One is, and again, this is something that isn't brought up a lot in the history of rockabilly, but I would include it. The Olympic Auditorium. there was a show that Johnny Lydon had, and he had two bands open for him. One was this sort of, this, and also to give proper credit, this is a story that I heard from Diane Gamboa. So, if you
Johnny Lydon, like Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols.
Yeah, but this was oh man, they're gonna pull my music card on this one. It was the band was
Public
it wasn't Sex
Image?
Pistols. It was post Sex Pistols band.
Public Image Limited.
It was Public Image Limited. And so this is a huge story in Los Lobos' history, but it's never really brought up as like a rockabilly anecdote, right? And again, this is Diane Gamboa's story. But it does play a kind of a big role, not big role, but plays a significant role in the book. And the way she tells the story is that they had two bands that opened up for Public Image. And one was, these Tejano dudes from El Paso, who went out there and were booed off the stage and gave up the ghost rather quickly, right? All these white kids were there to see, Johnny Rotten. So they kicked him off. The next band to open was Los Lobos. And Los Lobos go out there and they do their Los Lobos thing, right? Awesome, talented musicians. And they start getting booed off the stage. To piss off these punk rockers further, they stop their set and they start playing traditional rockabilly as if it's Memphis 54. The crowd hates it, right? But they don't care, right? They don't care. This is LA. This is their city. This is their stage. And that sort of, defiant attitude, right? And Los Lobos, right? They have a rich and storied career. They play rockabilly, right? They're not like they're not typically thought of as, a rockabilly band, the way that, maybe Big Sandy's band would have been thought of as a rockabilly band, or like even like a roots rock band that, some of these other groups might be thought of, right? The others kind of really thought of as like, East LA's Los Lobos.
Yeah. But
that sort of Boyle Heights, East LA, FU attitude, the defiant attitude, right, is something that you see in the rockabilly scene proper, generations on down the line. That particular performance, right, of them playing rockabilly to the crowd's dismay, caught the attention of the Alvins from the Blasters. And so then you see sort of, that connection happen. And then, Los Lobos then kind of, blowing up and I don't say going mainstream, but their career being taken in another level, right? The Blasters, right? They were with Ronnie Weiser, in Rolling Rock Records. And
yeah.
Ronnie Weiser, that's a whole other story for a whole other interview. Definitely a character, but also definitely a huge role in the LA scene at that time. And that's the other tricky thing too, with this book is that I focus on the 2000s, right? I'm very upfront to the focus on 2000s. LA has always had a thriving rockabilly scene. And so even like, in the early 80s, there's an album called Best of LA Rockabilly that has these revival bands, right? And even before then, like Ray Campy, these other folks that are LA locals, LA has always had rockabilly, before, during, and after the focus of my book, right? But the significant shift of the demographics of the scene that I focus on in the book, for me, was significant enough to really kind of roll my sleeves up and dig in. And that in no way is a disrespect or disregard for, performers from the early 90s or 80s or 70s. So I wanted to also make that really clear in the book as well, that, there are these folks in these kids in the 2000s, right, that they're building, right? They're building on, that's another inside joke. They're building on a foundation put forth by these previous artists. And that's also, I'm going to throw this out. That's a Dave Stuckey joke. So there's a Facebook group called Laying the Foundation, 1990s Rockabilly. And hopefully I'm not going to steal too many people's bits today. Sorry, Diane Gamboa. This is, the reason why that Facebook group is called that is because, these guys were getting, and gals were getting paid peanuts during that time, that the only way they could justify it was to say, well, we're building a foundation. That's the name of the Facebook group. But they were in fact building a foundation, right? That, these kids in the 2000s and contemporarily had not profited, but had benefited from.
Cool, man. You bring up Los Lobos, and of course, Los Lobos were part of La Bamba and stuff like that. But you talk about Richie Valens, since it is a Teatro Centro Cultural in the San Fernando Valley, and our patron saint of Richie Valens, Ricardo Valenzuela. But going off of that, it's almost a myth that the three people who passed away are like almost myths or like giants in the rockabilly scene, right? Like I guess my question is like, what people think is rockabilly isn't really rockabilly, right? Like
Right.
It's just rock and roll versus rockabilly. So you had artists who, played differently, like Chan Romero, right? Or something like that.
Yeah. So rockabilly again, and I push back a little bit on some of the definitions. Again, like I'll go back to this idea of narratives, right? How we define things, how we differentiate things. That these are stories that we tell, right? That this isn't amoeba where the sections are nicely subdivided, right? There's and again, this is going not to make it too academic, but this is like Professor George Lipsitz and Professor Gay Johnson talking about that these artists, right, they're working at the same places, right? They're inhabiting sort of the same cultural waters, and they're influencing, and they're stealing and poaching and sharing from each other. So for me, the lines around what is or isn't rockabilly, I think really comes down to how someone defines what they like, right? Mm-hmm. So if you don't like rockabilly with drums, you can say, well, really rockabilly, it doesn't have drums, right? It's the bass that does the percussion, the slap bass, that's the percussion, really doesn't have drums, right? But that's a question of personal taste, right? And a lot of times, we make our personal tastes the definitions, and again, that goes to claims of what is authentic, what isn't authentic, and sometimes claims to our ownership of scenes sometimes, right? But aside from that, the sort of late 1950s sort of sound, right? That kind of like Chad Romero, not Johnny Burnett, Johnny Carroll, that particular take on rock and roll carries with it this feel of juvenile delinquency. And in part, that's how the music was marketed by that point in time, right? Well, kids like this new rock and roll thing, right? Let's make sure that these are songs and things that kids can relate to. And since this is like a thing that kids are performing, right? Just picking up guitars and just trying their best. Let's sign kids to record labels, right? Put out a 45, make as much money as we can off them, and then move on to the next thing, right? So that sort of late 50s sound is a huge, part of rockabilly. The tricky thing with music in the rockabilly scene is that because it adheres to a really specific way in which shows are put on, which sort of, has its roots in the UK, music sort of gets subdivided into these genres of like boppers, which are, music that has a little bit more of like more emphasis on the downbeat, jivers, which are more sort of, music that are kind of seen more as like partner dancing music. And then strollers, which are a little bit more sort of not necessarily mellow, but the tempo is a little bit, mid-range. And so there's more of a interest and emphasis put on whether, those songs meet those styles of dance more so than whether, what this was recorded in 57 versus this was recorded in 56, right? Which does, call into question like these ideas around, what is authentic rockabilly? What is authentic rock and roll? And I think for Raza, the fact that our culture up and down, for generations has had to deal with questions of authenticity and rejecting notions of authenticity from, the perspective of like, a blood quantum, with our, with the caste system back in, the colonial days, to questions of sort of, what cultures were, or what cultural practices were allowed to partake of, or not, right? That since we already had that within our wheelhouse of rejecting notions of authenticity, and sometimes, playfully pitting authenticity against itself, the influx of Raza into rockabilly and being able to sort of upturn these expectations around music and learn the rules and then turn them against themselves, right? Made an impact, right? So, a lot of those Teen Tops, those Blue Jets, a lot of that music, that's from the 60s, that's sort of, kind of beyond what you sort of see with the 50s focused rockabilly scene. But this is what this particular crowd knows and familiar with, right? This is a part of their pack of memories of sort of, of an atomic era that they can relate to. So you're going to get La Plaga. You're going to get, these different original rock en español songs played at the shows that, aren't necessarily straight up Carl Perkins style rockabilly.
Yeah. You can see like that the genre of rockabilly is continuous and never really stopped, right? Even until like with glam rock too, they played almost the same chords. They played A, B, E, B, C, D, G, which are also country and western, know, and which also are for the most part norteño music too. It's the same kind of keys. And then you just go into even to punk. Play those three chords, you got a punk song, right? And then you have the Cramps, and it keeps on going, and so forth and so on. And it's just interesting how folks think that you have to be listening to one style versus the other style, and then if you're not, you're a poser, right? Right. And this whole, and this goes also just not just for rockabilly, but other scenes too. Like who's a poser, right? In ska, skinheads, and who's not, you're a poser. Punk, of course, and all that. So was there a discussion of that, or was that just something like, part of the, just.
Yeah. So for me, the poser thing that really boils down to contestations, right? Fights over authenticity. Yeah. Fights over authenticity. And for me, by and large, I stay out, and again, it's sort of beyond the scope of this book to like give you a list of, if you match these things, so you can go on the internet and find these lists of, how to be a rockabilly in 5 easy steps, right? You got to have grease in your hair. You got to wear pants with, 6-inch cuffs, so on and so forth. You can look online and see nonsense like that, right? I stayed as far away as I could from that. The authenticity question for me really came up when the pushback against sort of, an influx of Raza into the scene was something that I felt I kind of needed to get into, in part because the authenticity thing came up, right? And this is something, in interviewing different folks who were involved in the scene in the 90s, where there were Latinos there. There were Latinas there. There were Mexican American folks, Central American folks in the scene, right? In the 80s, in the 90s, right? Like, again, this book wouldn't have been possible if there weren't folks like, Robert Williams, Big Sandy performing in those eras. Rosie Flores, another person, right? Folks from these different bands and different musicians who, weren't just great Latino artists. This is great artists, period. Yeah. Right. So that's the other thing about the book as well. Like I get into, a lot of times, and this is a sidebar, but I think it's an important sidebar. I get into a lot of times, because it is Latino, because it is Chicano, right? People expect it to be hybrid, to be, they have to do it in Spanish and have, they have to have maracas on it and other stuff, right? We could just be good at what the thing is. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like we can just excel at what the thing is that you think it is and be better than everybody else too. Right. We don't have to Latinofy it. You know what I mean? And so that was another thing too that, that came up in the book, is that for sure, like there is hybridity, right? For sure, a band like Moonlight Cruisers, Pachuco Jose, they can do their 50s stuff, right? But then they'll go into like cumbias from the 1980s, you know, but they'll do it in you know, they'll do it in a classic style. They'll do it as if, you know, a band from, you know, from schooled in that feel, right? That vintage feel would do these, right? So for sure, you know, that type of hybridity is there, but also, you know, they can do straight ahead rock and roll rockabilly, you know, better than anybody else, you know what I mean? And not have to purposefully Latinofy it, you know what I mean? But, you know, it's kind of the sidebar. For, you know, thinking about, again, the authenticity question and people pushing back a little bit, not necessarily on the presence of brown bodies in the spaces, right? I'm sure, you know, the Doll Hut, Linda's Doll Hut, really cool venue in you know, in Orange County. They, you know, at times that they straight up had Klan rallies there, you know what I mean? For sure, you know, you know, would encounter spaces where the presence of brown bodies in these social spaces were resisted physically, right? But by and large, that wasn't the case, right? That those are like the exceptions to the norms. By and large, the issue was that the sort of cultural cachet and changes that these, you know, Latino consumers who are now producers were bringing, that became what people fought over, right? Well, I don't want all this Black Central Avenue R&B in my rockabilly show. I want, you know, I want to sound more country western, of course, and that's ahistorical anyway, because, you know, rockabilly and all 1950s music, right? If you know, if they're rock and roll, they have Black elements in it anyway. But that's a whole other question. For real, you know. I don't want, you know, I don't want these kids wearing, you know, gabardine and it looks like, you know, it's, you know, what is it? It looks like a 1940s nightclub. It looks like, you know, Cinema de Oro nightclub, right? In this place. Like, I don't like that. I don't like these kids, you know, I don't like what they're bringing. And so it wasn't a question of like, you know, I don't want these brown bodies. I don't want their tastes, you know, or the way that the things that they're into are not what I'm into. And that then became sort of the authenticity question as it came down to race. It came down to like what people's tastes were, you know? And again, for me, that's fascinating. That's interesting. But for me, the crux of the book couldn't be just about that, you know? And for me, like, I love talking about music. I love talking about style. I love talking about cars. You know, those are all things that I love and really enjoy conversing about and exploring. But for me, like, I really had to like sit down and think about like, well, what are the stakes here? You know what I mean? Like, what is happening in the world more broadly that this scene informs me about? So I had to build a broader context about LA in the Schwarzenegger years and in the George Bush years that I had taken for granted because, you know, like you know, we lived it, right? It doesn't feel like history the way that looking at like the Chicano movement, right? Or looking at the 40s, World War II, that feels like history. For me, the 2000s and 2010s, that feels like yesterday, you know. Even 1999 feels like it was 10 years ago, you know. So I really had to, in this book, build a context around what was happening in that era. Like, what was the impact of 9/11, right? Where you had all these Latinos being confused for Arabs, right? And so in terms of like, you know, hate crimes happening, right? The targeting of Latinos, you know, in this sort of racial confusion in that era. What is the impact of things like the Patriot Act? What is the impact of the Schwarzenegger budget cuts during this era? Right.
And do you think that well, I guess it's part of it now too. This very white supremacist, MAGA-ish, is that part of the scene? Like, you know, I mean, we still know there's racists in the scene. Is there an influence? Like, do people show up? I mean, I know like in Scott shows, like sharp is always there, skinheads against racial prejudice. You know, there's that, but there's always a sense of that, like, you know, we ain't gonna have that shit. But I know that like at Rockabilly scenes, even at Viva Las Vegas, there's always those fools that always like, you know, have the fucking the flag, right, and they have the banner and they're throwing it up. And
yeah,
you know,
no, the man, you know, that Confederate flag, man, that's everywhere. You know, that's, you know, much more, you know, it's one of the symbols of rockabilly. It has been for a long time, you know, the sort of, and again, it's like, you know, in some cases it's like the General Lee, Dukes of Hazzard, like it's just, you know, it's this ever-present thing. And in other cases, it very much isn't intentional, right? This is, you know, this is a white Southern heritage thing that, you know, I'm going to just display proudly because of that. That's my stake to my claim.
yeah,
Right. And so the you know, to his credit, Tom Ingram, who's the organizer of Viva Las Vegas, has banned the Confederate flag at that festival. And he caught a lot of flack for it, right? Not from anyone in LA, right? But for, you know, the music fans and, you know, across the country, you know, gave him hell. Kudos to him for, you know, for taking that stance.
Yep.
But, you know, the Confederate flag, and for me, it's a lot of times it's a tacit acceptance of that, right? Folks' overlooking of that symbol that speaks volumes. Within sort of LA, and really sort of contextualizing white supremacy as a system, right? As, you know, as not, you know, and again, I had this conversation with folks who are sort of from the apartheid era, right? That, you know, racists and racism were these aberrations, right? That you, of course, you had to fight and stamp out.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a lot of us who, you know, have, you know, kind of paid attention to historically hierarchies of power and how systems operate, social systems, you know, the criminal justice system, immigration system, right? How these are entrenched ways in which white supremacy have, you know, kind of taken root and held root in these lands, you know. The normality of things that we take for granted, right, that are white supremacist, thus renders our ability to resist in some ways not impossible, but in some ways limited to the forms of resistance that we can take, that we have the agency to do so.
Yeah.
And so for me, thinking about like, and there's a quick little segment in the book about, you know, kids in high school, right? Kids in high school greasing their hair, you know, with their creepers and their rolled jeans, right? Eschewing the dress code, right? And again, it for a lot, you know, for us, it feels quaint, you know what I mean? But for, you know, and for them, it might not be this, you know, overt political act, right? But that's resistance, right? That's resistance to power. And thinking about how dress codes are enforced, and what schools have dress codes and what schools don't have dress codes, and what is acceptable forms of dress and what isn't, the gendered, the raced, right? The heteronormative aspects of those practices of dress codes, right? All of a sudden, that kid deciding to buck the dress code has more meaning than maybe we give them credit for, whether that's an intentional revolutionary act or not, right? And for me, that's really what a lot of, you know, the cultural practices of Razabilly boiled down to, right? Was just these normal everyday folks trying to live their best life, right? To use the nomenclature of our time, seeking leisure and seeking pleasure in an alienating world that didn't want to offer them either, became political, whether they saw it as a political act or not. And I think for me that, that is one of the big takeaways of the book, in so much that, like, for me talking about it, like, well, I had to build the context. I had to, like, I had to, like, paint a picture of LA at that time, and paint a picture of the political and economic landscape. Right. So people could understand, when you find a shirt at a thrift store, right, that you paid $2 for, and you flip on eBay for $450, right? Ways of the book, what that means and what that tells us about the experiences of Raza in LA at that time, right? That, the practice of thrift store shopping, that's a working class practice, right? That's a survival practice. We wouldn't shop at the thrift stores if we had enough money to go to Nordstrom's or whatever else, right? We know what to look for. We recognize, and we have that eye for things that have value and worth. That's a survivor's tactic. That's something that's a skill you pick up because you don't have a lot, right? So
what you bring up something else, and I was gonna quote you on this because you would flip stuff, right? But also it's like that was part of, that's what you did, right? Not just to do it, but also like as a form of survival, right? And to quote you, you said, "The money earned from selling clothes supplemented my modest income as a TA and helped fund my research."
That is true.
Page 118. See, I read it, fool. I read the book. For all those people out there thinking I didn't read the book, I fucking read it, all right? But yeah, I think that it's funny because, like, most of the people that we know and who are in different scenes do this, right? And this is not just in like the rock scene, but also in the hip hop scene too. Like, I just know a kid who selling shirts at the Rose Bowl, sold a shirt for like $800, and I'm like, what? But hey, good for him, man, because he's out there working, surviving, and just trying to make a living, but also in his own scene, And for you, it's like, it's also, I'm glad that you wrote that in there because it also brings into light that you had a modest income, right, as a TA, but you struggle not just as like, your personal stuff, but also like as like getting your PhD, right? And I think that if someone read this, and if they were a student at any university, they would kind of connect with that. Like, I think that that's a line that's really important, and I hope that people understand that. Find your way to survive financially, emotionally, and mentally, because if it's going to be hard, but you can do it, right? And you can write a book like this, just as like, your
no, man, stuff, the struggle is like, real. And I think for you and me, it's a good reminder too. And like I said, I'm an organizer, man. Like, I came up as a student organizer, was in the nonprofit sector doing advocacy work. And so, and us coming from, Mecha and these other backgrounds, like for me, you think about La Causa, right? The struggle as this explicit causa that you go and you march, and that, you raise hell, and you occupy buildings, and that's valuable work. We need people to do that work. But again, the struggle, right? The struggle to want to live a good life, right? And that so many people are engaged in. That is capital T, capital S, the struggle also, and for me, someone who always sort of like dismissed culture, right, as political, and dismissed, well, man, they're not getting anything done, right? This isn't revolutionary, like, it's like, well, as someone who's a haranero, right, like a lot of people bristled at this idea of the Son Jarocho movement. Well, it's not really a movement, I mean, in terms of like, the Crystal City was a movement, but that still doesn't mean it doesn't mean anything. I mean, that still doesn't mean it's not valuable. And I kind of had to come to grips with that with Rockabilly also, that, even though it's not this explicit political thing where, go vote for Bernie, right? That doesn't mean that it's also not significant,
Yeah. So we also talked about beforehand, you have a list, right? And a playlist, sorry.
Yeah.
And we wish we can play some of the songs and all of the songs, but we want to make sure that that they get played, but we can't, they can be played, and then what happens. Facebook's like, so unfortunately we can't do that, but we can discuss like the on Nico's playlist, and hopefully you can go out there and go to the Spotify list that he's gonna have up there, but also just look for other ones too that might not be on that list because Spotify is doesn't have all the songs.
Yeah. So the playlist, this is something that I'm working with UT with the press, making available to folks. So when the book comes out, it'll be through their Spotify account.
When does the book come out?
We're looking at July 13th.
July 5th, and they can get it at UT Austin Press.
Yes. You can get it at different places. Folks may have different kinds of feelings about Amazon, so I don't want to plug Amazon, but for sure you can get it at the press directly. But again, there's different ways you can get it through different bookstores, Amazon being one of them. But if you can, just get it through the press. Yeah,
and possibly later on, Theatrichas will probably have that as well. So just keep an eye.
Absolutely, that would be great. All right. So the playlist itself, again, that's something that I've been working on, and I can shout out some of the different songs that sort of made the playlist. And then when it's made available to everybody, it'll have like a narrative with it. So I'll sort of walk people through the different songs that are there, and why these ones were chosen. I really didn't want to do the best of. I think there's DJs, there's actual musicians who are much much more qualified to do the definitive songs of LA Rockabilly or Razabilly, if you want to term it as such, than me. So I really chose songs that I felt were much more like complimentary of the book itself than necessarily a best of. The first pick that I had to open with Big Sandy. I had to open with Big Sandy, so I chose a cut from his album Turntable Matinee called Power of the 45 Parts 1 and 2. So they're two different tracks, but I view them as one performance. And this really, that particular song, it's an homage to old music, right? Literally the song is the Power of the 45, the 45 record. But in it, he runs through a litany of musicians, right, that are such influences, right? Not just on the LA scene, but like LA music in overall, right? Like, Lil Julian Herrera, the Midnighters, Sleepy LaBeef, right? These different artists that are the genealogical sort of progenitors of what rockabilly music and not in the scene, but in terms of like roots rock music overall owe their lives to. And so opening with that song for me was also my homage to him for sure, but also it really centers the music in a way that I feel the music really needs to take center place. Let me actually see what I had pulled together.
Nico, do you have do you have the playlist as a link?
I don't, because it's still getting worked on.
Okay, cool.
So it's not ready for public consumption quite yet.
Well, yeah, no, but it's a work in progress.
It's a work in progress, and it will be available within the month.
Cool, man.
After that, I went into Chan Romero and his work, Hippie Hippie Shake. Not so because I wanted to pick Hippie Hippie Shake. There was another track of his that I wanted to use, but wasn't available on Spotify, so I went with the one he's more familiar with. In part because I also needed to pay homage to the Raza rock and rollers of the 50s. Chan, I had a chance, a really great pleasure to offer a few thoughts on Romero for Latino USA, this NPR piece. I really recommend folks look into.
I really do too. I listened to that a while ago when it came out, and I highly recommend listening to that. And also, congrats on that, dude.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Chan, he's still rocking and rolling. He's he lives in Palm Springs, and he was sort of positioned to be the heir to Richie Valence's legacy after Richie had passed away in the plane crash. Moved into Richie's house. Richie's mom pretty much adopted him, And his vocal delivery, that style of rock and roll, is so emblematic of the kind of music that you'll encounter in the scene, right? The vocal delivery, the sort of almost like snot-nosed punk take on rock and roll. That sort of Johnny Carroll style, Joe Clay style, is something that the scene gravitates more towards than necessarily like a Carl Perkins approach to rock and roll. So yeah, definitely wanted to have Chow Romero high up on the list.
And that song was covered by it was made famous by the Beatles, right?
Yes.
And just an FYI, the Beatles did cover a lot of songs by a lot of these artists. It's just a fun little fucking fact.
Yeah, absolutely. After that, I had to go with Louis and the Wildfires. Lil Louis, one of the first crop of this 2000s era Razabilly transformation, and of course Wild Records really being such a huge impact in the LA scene and internationally. It had to absolutely include Louis and the Wildfires. Was going to go with Louis and the Wild Teens, some of the early stuff, but it's not on Spotify. But his work with the Wildfires is just as amazing.
That's the one with Santiago and Victor in it too, right?
I believe so. Yeah.
I know there's fun fact. Santiago and I were in Mecha at Adley Valley College. So he was a Mechista. I haven't seen you in a while, Fu. If you're watching, hit me up.
Santi. And that's another thing, Valley Boys, and again, it really calls us to think about LA as a region, LA as a metropolis.
We used to play Morrissey songs at his pad.
After Louis and the Wildfires, I went with Los Tintops and La Plaga. And again, really paying homage to sort of the taste of Latino consumers within Razabilly in the 2000s. So bringing with them, right, a whole cachet of music that they were familiar with that may not have been sort of the taste of those that had been sort of more ensconced in the LA sound, right? Sort of that more Chicano, brown-eyed soul kind of roundabout way to rock and roll. Mm-hmm. And that having been said, I followed that up with Winona Cars, Till the Well Runs Dry. And this is a straight ahead Central Avenue style rhythm and blues number, right? And again, the blackness of rock and roll is something that can't be dismissed, right, or can't be ignored. And the bringing with them this generations worth of black and brown solidarity and creativity to the scene, and the influx of and preference for rhythm and blues doo-wop that was very much cooked into Chicano LA culture for all those generations was another really needle moving thing for the LA scene in the 2000s.
What's next?
Following that, I included Vicky Tafoya in the Big Beat, one of her newer recordings, Boy with the Angel Eyes, just as a way to not only pay homage to her, she plays a huge role in the book, but also to again, really give a shout out to that classic lowrider sound.
Yeah.
And that's something too that I think can't be overlooked, in that Raza's relationship, especially in LA, to 1950s music, right? It's not necessarily one that is rock driven, or even in terms of the feel of music. It's ballads, right? It's sort of the slowed down, smoothed out vocals that if you listen to side A is always the one that gets played on Art Laboe and etc. Mm-hmm. If you flip it over, side B is always a dance number, right? Yeah. So for a lot of, another common narrative was that, kids that started getting into record collecting flipping over those lowrider oldies and finding a rock and roll number, also being a way that they got into the scene as well. So the last few I can talk about a little bit about the last two, in part because they're pretty related. I included Janice Martin and Ray Campy. So Janice Martin, I included her work Bang Bang, and then Ray Campy, excuse me, How Low Do You Feel? In part because the scene, not just in LA but overall, the scene really was one that had so much love and respect for the original performers. And really celebrated them in a way that I think, in many ways, the rest of the world kind of had moved on from or had ignored, but also allowed you to see them as people, right? And so I think, especially for like LA and in the United States, more so than internationally, and with Ray Campy being an LA local, just seeing them out and seeing them as people really sort of upset this frozen in time sort of feel of the records or of the recorded music. And especially for Janice Martin, for her, when she performed at like Vegas and stuff, if Big Sandy was the MC, he would always, kind of introduce her as, and this is true, she was referred to as the female Elvis, right? But he would always bring in, well, in reality, Elvis was the male her, right? And, the gender dynamics of the scene is something that I think we talk quite a lot about in the book, and so much as that it's rock and roll, man. It's like it's male dominated on the performer side, but in terms of like who comes out, who supports the scene and is the generative consumer of the scene and make sure that things happen and run, it's all women's work and women's labor.
Yeah, even
though that's not necessarily notice when it's mostly men on stage. So that's also something that the book explores as well. The last two, Rosa Maria by the Moonlight Cruisers, again, sort of the influx of cumbias as a working class form of music that spoke to Latino taste, was really emblematic of that sort of mid 2000s period. And I end with the Lakesiders, Parachute, which isn't rockabilly at all. It's sort of a late 60s era, again, ballad, but their sort of personas and sort of stage presence in sort of as like 40s style, pachucos, and also their real adherence to identifying as indigenous, I think really is sort of a shift in what can be done with music or scenes or styles that evoke the past. That's different than what folks in the 2000s, very, very different than folks in the 2000s and previously were doing with retro stuff, right? But that's kind of for the last few years where I kind of see things going a little bit more. Awesome. Folks now like really kind of reaching back further than the 50s, looking at the 40s and seeing what they can do with and play with those influences.
That's dope, man. So we're wrapping it up right now in these couple of minutes, and we wanted to go into a couple of other things. We just don't have time. We wanted to go into the car culture. We kind of did touch upon the car culture. There's that meme of the two strong arms like that. One had cholos, one had rockabillys, and it said car culture. It's the same cars, 50s cars. It's kind of like you said, it's a scene, man. It's all like it kind of merges into each other. The rockabilly aesthetic and the Razabilly aesthetic too. That was something we were gonna discuss, and we kind of did. The dress and stuff like that. Any final words?
No, I think for me, this conversation, I think we wanted to keep it sort of light and casual, and really that is the feel of Razabilly, right? It's the word itself, and again, we had originally had wanted to share a little bit more about the sort of creator of Razabilly, Ruth Hernandez, sort of her story, and that would have been more Morrissey stuff and more K-Rock stuff, but folks can read the book about that. But really, there is this camp element of Razabilly that is sort of speaks to a very much not necessarily Latino but very Chicana sensibility in terms of our sense of humor that has a sort of little bit of a melancholic edge to it, you know, that, you know, this sort of self-deprecating, poking fun type of, you know, feel that you see also in camp. So Razabilly itself, like, you know, yes, it is a play on the word, you know, Raza and Rockabilly, and Raza kind of sounds like rock, and you put it together, right? It's not necessarily something that, you know, people are supposed to take that seriously. You know what I mean? So there is a tongue-in-cheek aspect to the name and the word itself, and that's a part of that experience, right? And again, sort of the notion that seeking fun and seeking pleasure, these aren't necessarily things that we typically think of as political, right? But there's elements of resistance in them, like literally cooked into the DNA of what these things are. So, you know, I know because I don't think I've really mentioned or defined what Razabilly was, but I wanted to just throw that out there before we wrapped up today.
Yeah, man. Thanks again, Nico, my friend, brother. Really happy for you, really proud for you. Like from the bottom of my heart, like we're all really proud of you, dude.
Thank
like,
you.
For real, like this is really important. If you have any more questions, you can email us, text us, whatever, if you know us. And if you don't know us, you can just IG us. This is the end of our program. We hope you learned something new and that you're inspired to continue to be creative. We have a survey you can fill out to give us like your feedback, and it'll offer you a coupon code for 15% off of a book purchase. All right, so go check that out. There's a lot more programs happening at the Achuchas. One that you should really go look for is at 4:00. My partner, my fiance, she is going to be teaching about embroidery on cards. So stay for that at 4:00. It's going to be amazing. Also, I have a book that's just coming out, and I'm going to have a talk in about 20 minutes. It's this one right here. Yes. It was really cool. It was also done with the We Rise program and Mesli. So just want to plug myself in on that. Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you. All the people at the Achuchas. Thank you, Johnny, who's editing, recording us too. Thank you, guys. Have a good night. Have a good day.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Love, peace, and hair grease.